Does anyone really know the future? Are the psychics and mystical figures of the New Age genuine? And what about the ancient prophecies of Nostradamus? Is it possible to make useful predictions, ones that really make a practical contribution to the way people actually live? During the early part of the century, there was a lot of optimism about modern science's ability to not only predict the future, but also to take most of the stings out of it. But while science and its accompanying technological marvels have contributed to making our lives easier, much of this knowledge has now begun to turn on us and poison the very earth, water and air which we depend on for our survival. Can we really trust anyone when it comes to a knowledge about the future?
If I could demonstrate to you that a clear prediction of a future event was made 35 years in advance, and that the instructions that accompanied that prediction were so clear and accurate that everyone who followed them was safe from death in a terrible war, would you be interested? Then if I told you that there were additional predictions with equally clear instructions from that same source which apply to your future, would I have your attention? Good. Well, here's the story.
The Jews had just revolted against Roman rule. In February of AD 67, the Emperor Nero sent his general Vespasian to restore order. Within a year, he'd fought his way through Galilee and surrounded Jerusalem. Within 5 months, Jerusalem fell to the Romans. The temple was burned, most of the inhabitants were killed, and almost all of the walls pushed down. Only the 3 towers of Herod's palace and a small section of the wall were spared. Not only did Jesus predict the destruction of Jerusalem, he also gave a sign which allowed his followers to escape the city. The instructions are in Luke 21:21.
Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and them which are in Jerusalem must leave it, and those out in the country must not enter it.
Huge numbers of people fled into Jerusalem for refuge. But the Jewish Christians did the opposite. They left the city. The historian Eusebius writes that the Christians fled Jerusalem and crossed the Jordan, then travelled 80 kilometres north to this location, the ancient city of Pella. But how did they know when to escape?
The Gospels of Matthew, Mark and Luke record the very last instructions Jesus gave his disciples. At the time, they were probably looking down from the Mount of Olives across the valley to the Jerusalem temple and commenting on its splendour. After all, it was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Jesus startled them with the first of several predictions in this chapter.
As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down.
Sure enough, Jerusalem and its temple were destroyed by the Romans in AD 70 after a long 4-year siege. According to the best historical source,
Caesar ordered the whole city and the temple to be razed to the ground. Flavius Josephus.
Having heard about their temple's fate, the disciples then asked for signs to indicate Jesus' return at the end of time.
For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Messiah, and they will lead many astray.
The earliest Christians were saved from the deceptive work of false messiahs by listening to Jesus' warning. But over the past 20 years alone, many hundreds of people have lost their lives because of false messiahs, just as Jesus predicted.
In one of the most bizarre stories of the year, American law enforcement officers stormed the headquarters of an obscure religious cult in Texas. and a 51-day siege began.
Who's going to bring that book?
Inside the building were cult leader David Koresh and more than 100 members of his Branch Davidian sect, including many children. The initial assault had been to hunt for illegal firearms. In mid-April, the FBI attacked again and brought the siege to a terrible conclusion. When fire broke out, a religious commune became a funeral pyre. Most of the cultists died, including Koresh.
You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom.
Warfare has been fairly frequent throughout history. Probably the thing that has changed in the 20th century has been the destructive capacity of those involved in war and the ability of people remote from the theatre of war to contribute to that war. Today it is not unusual for a war being fought in a specific part of the globe to draw in the involvement of nations from the other side of the globe. Bosnia, for instance, has had European and American intervention. So the impact of war is greater in the 20th century, particularly with the advent of technology, which has allowed armies to move much more quickly, much greater distances, allowed armies to concentrate, which has made them much bigger, and has also given them extra destructive power because of the added weight of armaments like the bullet, the cannon shell, and of course aircraft and guided missiles. The sheer destructive potential of war today is much higher than it was.
I think we can say two things. Number one, things will not permanently improve before the end of the age. The dawn will follow a night of horror. And secondly, there will be an intensification of these terrible things, even though we have had them all through history, because technology actually increases the possibility of calamity in a greater way. This shows the exponential growth in the possibility of horror.
There will be famines and earthquakes in various places.
The modern media are delivering a continual sequence of images of natural disasters around the world. Sometimes this can become quite overwhelming. Many of us have become hardened by perpetual scenes of starving children, homeless families, and crumbling buildings. Note that these events seem to take place with greater frequency than before and in new places.
Measuring 6.6 on the Richter scale, the quake struck beneath a heavily populated area.
Did you feel it? Hey, see it? Hey. Woo. Oh, God, I can't believe that.
In 1994, the people of Los Angeles also felt the earth move beneath them. But luckily, it wasn't the expected big one.
There are few natural occurrences more frightening than earthquakes. Those who've experienced them never forget the sense of panic that sweeps over you when the ground beneath your feet begins to move. China has earthquake records going back thousands of years, some of which have cost over 500,000 lives. According to Jesus, in the last days, earthquakes will occur in place after place. Here's a list of major earthquakes this century. This is pretty impressive data. But are earthquakes actually on the increase?
Most earthquakes are caused by the plates of the earth moving against each other. And in the past, these plates have been moving at rather constant speeds. But there is evidence that they have moved faster in the past, in the long distant past, and there is nothing stopping that happening again, almost without warning. So it is possible that earthquakes in the future could increase tremendously in both frequency and intensity, but we won't know when that's going to happen.
While modern science gives us a different explanation for what causes earthquakes and famines compared with Jesus' day, it is interesting that scientists and environmentalists are taking over from religious teachers the task of predicting the end of the world. For example, the internet site, sponsored by the Millennium Institute and known as the State of the World Indicators.
Australia is the world's driest continent, and we now are developing into a situation where water is becoming critical. In many places in Australia, the water availability is over-allocated. This is particularly so in the Murray-Darling Basin, but also in some of our coastal rivers. So we are facing a water shortage in many parts of Australia. Now, it's not only just the amount of water that is now becoming in short supply, but the quality of that water. There are pesticides appearing in the water and herbicides, and these are coming from our agricultural pursuits. And in this respect, the vast cotton farming is bad news in that it's contributing quite a load of pesticides to our waters. Now, at this stage, though, our waters are safe to drink in almost all places in Australia, but they're not safe for the animals that have to live in it. So that the water quality has deteriorated, and we now have problems with the environment. There just isn't enough water for the environment, and the quality has decreased. And it's very hard to balance all this. And to be quite honest, I'm not too confident about the future.
Another sign Jesus gave his disciples concerned the sun, moon and stars.
Immediately after the suffering of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of heaven will be shaken.
Is our future really in the stars, as astrologers claim? The regular, predictable movements of these heavenly bodies were widely studied among ancient peoples. The fact that they moved seemed to indicate that they possessed power, and the predictability of these movements gave some sort of assurance that their powers were friendly. From time to time, however, the movements became irregular. For example, what we know today as eclipses of the moon or the sun seemed to the ancients the devouring of one by the other. A shooting star appeared to them to be a fixed star which broke loose and shot away from its fixed place. Such happenings caused widespread panic because it looked to the ancients like the fixed order of the stars was breaking up with terrible consequences. The ancient Babylonians carefully observed the movements of the stars. They observed that some of the planets moved differently from the others. The Babylonian gods were thought to live on the various planets. This Babylonian interest in the stars spread widely through the ancient world and provided a foundation for two very different practices of stargazing: astronomy and astrology. Both are alive and well today. Astronomy, developed from the ancient Babylonian stargazers, is the science of observing and measuring the universe. Australian astronomers make major contributions to the knowledge of the universe, partly because this country enjoys very good conditions for sky watching. The second form of stargazing, inherited from the Babylonians, is astrology. Astrology is the practice of trying to determine our individual futures by studying the heavens. Astrology has changed little since ancient Babylonian times. It still assumes that the stars and planets exert a direct influence over people here on Earth. And by studying their regular movements, people can learn something about the future. This influence is assumed to be so direct that the ancients believed no one could escape their destiny as determined by the stars. Just as the movements of the stars were regular and could not be changed, so the events they produced in people's lives were unavoidable. Modern interest in astrology is on the increase. When Jesus mentioned these signs in the sun, moon and stars, he said that his return to earth will be marked by the complete overthrow of other influences and powers.
But what about those of us with a scientific view of the universe? Modern astronomy has led to a new revolutionary understanding of the universe. The most chilling chapter in the modern scientific view of the universe is the closing one.
We do know that in recent years we have detected or discovered more what we call Earth orbit crossing objects. These are asteroids that, because of their orbits, cross the Earth's orbit, and therefore the probability of the Earth running into one of them or one of them running into the Earth is higher than we might have previously thought. In the event that you had a tremendous collision that was able to completely cause the sun to no longer be visible from the surface, we'd be in big trouble.
Jesus also compared the last days, before the end, to the days of Noah when the earth was destroyed by a flood. Noah's story is recorded near the beginning of the Bible. Society had become so corrupt that God decided to destroy it and start over. Jesus said,
"As the days of Noah were, so the days of the coming of the Son of Man shall be."
This is how the Bible describes the days of Noah.
God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence.
4 conditions of the people who lived in Noah's day stand out in the story. Wickedness, describing the overall human condition of Noah's day. Evil, describing human plans and intentions as being continually wicked. Corruption. This word is used 3 times, stressing the widespread extent of ancient corruption. And violence. This was the picture of the closing days just before the earth was destroyed by a flood. Has our own age reached the same level of corruption and violence as Noah's time? What about corruption? A corrupt society allows people to exploit and take unfair advantage of others who are unable to defend themselves. Are children at risk today even from parents, teachers and religious leaders, the very people who should be foremost in protecting them? There is no doubt that screen violence is increasing. Todd Gitlin suggests one reason for this.
In recent years, market forces have driven screen violence to an amazing pitch. As the movies lost much of their audience, especially adults, to television, the studios learned that the way to make their killing, so to speak, was to offer on big screens what the networks would not permit on the small. This meant, among other things, grisly violence, aimed to attract the teenagers. The Imagebusters, 1994.
Violence on the screen can inspire aggression in children. After watching violent programs, some children become hostile, domineering, uncooperative, or more fearful. All these conclusions are contained in a recently published report, Violence in Youth, by the American Psychological Association's Commission on Violence and Youth.
Depictions of violence in the mass media may reinforce the tendency towards aggression in a young child who is already exhibiting aggressive behavior, says this report. There is absolutely no doubt that higher levels of viewing violence on television are correlated with increased acceptance of aggressive attitudes and increased aggressive behavior.
Methodology on the research into television violence has changed recently, and I think it is giving a better reflection of the real impact of television violence. And that is undermining some of the popular beliefs in the one-to-one correlation between what is screened on television and in films and what happens in real life.
In 1982, after the cable television broadcast of The Deer Hunter, several people killed themselves playing Russian roulette, which was featured in the movie. American youths recently were killed and maimed when they lay down on the centre strip of a highway, imitating a scene from a Walt Disney movie, The Program.
Despite the publicity given to so-called copycat murders and crimes, the impact of screen violence is probably not as significant as most people would think it is. Stories need conflict, and the easiest way to get conflict is to introduce violence, which is why television uses it. Television violence is a code by which stories are told. And so most people watch quite a bit of violence and are not in the ordinary sense of the word violent. Where television violence can be damaging is on very small children who have not yet learnt that television is not reality. Although it's capable of showing us aspects of reality. For example, the terrorist attacks in New York, which were screened around the world. I guess the effect of television in this case is to make all of us feel afraid of something that was happening to some people.
The evidence is clear that Jesus made predictions which were fulfilled with amazing accuracy and which saved his early followers from one of the greatest calamities of the ancient world, the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. They were also saved from false messiahs who led hundreds of innocent followers to their doom. What about his predictions concerning conditions near the end of time and his return to earth? We have seen how repeated events in our own world fit the description Jesus gave of the end time: false messiahs, wars, political unrest, disasters, especially earthquakes and famines, the rapidly decaying environment, the rise of superstition, especially astrology. We've also surveyed sobering similarities between conditions in Noah's day, just before God destroyed the earth with water, and the days we live in: corruption and violence. Jesus' return will be unmistakably different from anything that has happened before. This will be the most significant moment in Earth's history since its creation. The good news is that just like the early Christians, we can be ready because Jesus has given signs to keep us alert.
From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates.
While none of the signs Jesus gave us allows us to calculate the precise time of his return, like new leaves sprouting from the branches of a tree, they point us to the fact that the event cannot be far off. Jesus cautioned his disciples, "It is not for you to know the times or periods that the Father has set by his own authority." Acts 1:7. Instead of giving us the exact time, Jesus gave us something even more important: the encouragement to be ready. After all, nothing about our own lives is ever guaranteed. Our next breath may be our last. In this sense, Jesus' coming may be but a moment away for any one of us.
Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming.
So, how can we know the future? How can we be prepared for the future? The best way to be ready for the future is to know Jesus. By surrendering our lives to him, by admitting and confessing our failures and making a new commitment to live each day according to his will. Jesus has clearly demonstrated that he knows the future. He has warned us about what to expect and how to prepare for the tumultuous last days of Earth's history. A decision to commit your life to Jesus Christ is an investment in your peace of mind, because it's a decision that will remove your fear and uncertainty about the future. Can you afford to ignore it?